Okay, so before we get going, yes, I know, Horner's been sacked. But I was 6 pages deep into this script when the news broke, so it made no sense to delete everything and start something else while I was on a roll with this particular video. Plus, by the time Friday rolls around, we'll know a little bit more about what's going on, so yeah, it's probably best to come back on Friday when we know a little bit more about what's happened with the whole Horner Red Bull situation. Although, you know, do stay for this, because this is interesting as well. History is cool, and sometimes with Formula 1 you forget that there's a bit of prehistory there as well. Some people like to act like the championship was invented in 2016, much like people act like football was invented in 1992. But before 1950, there was Formula 1. Just, well, not as we know it. Which sounds odd, I know. Because we've been bombarded by logos all year with the Formula 1 broadcast going on and on and on and on about how it's the 75th anniversary of the series. But in reality, it's only the 75th anniversary of the Formula 1 World Championship, which started in 1950. Prior to that, there was Formula 1 racing, or just simply Grand Prix racing, where a bunch of blokes turned up to a racetrack and the winner took home a big prize. Hence the name, Grand Prix. It's French for big prize. Usually a massive sack of money. And actually, while on the subject, I was actually contacted by the French newspaper Le Monde in the run-up to the British Grand Prix to answer a few questions, and my quotes were published on Sunday. That was definitely not on my 2025 bingo card, but here we are. The bloke that wrote that article is now watching tennis at Wimbledon, which sounds like a downgrade, but yeah, that happened. It's weird what kind of doors this whole making video stuff will open, isn't it? And if you've seen pictures from the time, you'll see that Formula 1 is a completely different animal to how it was back in the 1950s. The cars have gone from basically bathtubs on wheels to 180-mile-an-hour bombs to ground effect wizards to, well, ground effect wizards, because 70s and today it's the same, well, sort of, but you know what I mean. I've put a comparison on your screen for you. The 1954 Maserati all the way up to the Lotus 49, the Ferrari 312T, the ground effect Lotus, the Lotus 98T Turbo Monster, through to the 1991 Jordan, the Ferrari F2000, the Renault R25, Red Bull RB9, the 2017 Mercedes, and now the current Constructors' Champions in McLaren. 70 years of evolution right in front of your eyes. Simply lovely. A few years ago in Assetto Corsa, I actually ran a 2020 Mercedes against a Lotus 49, a 312T and a 1950s Maserati to see if the Mercedes could lap them, and succeeded. The difference in pace was absolutely insane. The Mercedes passed the Alfa like it was stood still. But then again, it's a video game, so not exactly the best representation. And speaking of the 1950s, I thought I would go right back to the beginning to talk about the first car to ever win a World Championship race. The Alfa 158. But the funny thing is, this story doesn't actually start in 1950. It starts a couple of years before the Second World War, because the first examples of this car were built in 1937 and 1938. A gentleman called Gioacchino Colombo was the man responsible for the design, and ready to drive it were Alfa's main guys. Tazio Nuvolari, the Michael Schumacher of pre-war racing, Emilio Villoresi, Raymond Sommer, Jean-Pierre Wimille, Clemente Biondetti and Giuseppe Farina. By the summer of 1938, 3 of these cars were ready, and at the Copacciano Junior race, Villoresi took the car's first win. But the fun was short-lived. The war broke out in the September of 1939, with Italy being involved as part of the Axis powers. As a result, all the racing cars were thrown into storage, some hidden away in the hopes that the enemy wouldn't get their hands on them, or worse, destroy them. The Auto Union cars, the Mercedes cars, the Alfas, the Ferraris, the Bentleys, the Jags, all of them were hidden away or scrapped to recycle the parts for the war effort. With no racing going on, all they could do was wait. And wait for 7 or 8 years, they did. Apparently, the 158s were left in a cheese factory somewhere where they were at low risk of being destroyed, but there's only one website saying that, so take that claim with a pinch of salt. It would be funny if it was though. But racing didn't really resume again until around 1946 or 1947, when the first race at Silverstone happened, with the 24 Hours of Le Mans not resuming again until 1949. And looking at things, Alfa did have a great pool of drivers to pick from in this time period, because Wimille, Luigi Chinetti, Sommer and Nuvolari had stood on the top step of the Le Mans podium at least twice in the 7 Le Mans 24 Hours in the run-up to the Second World War. Wimille had won the 1939 edition in a Bugatti, with his co-driver being a guy called Pierre Véron. Put that into an accent that's less overly French and you get Pierre Véron, as in 255-mile-an-hour supercar. When racing started again after the war, there was a race held on the streets of Geneva in 1946, but there was also, and I didn't know this, a race in Tripoli in Libya in 1940. Now my granddad was in Libya in 1940, although this race was held in May. The North Africa campaign didn't start until June, so they managed to squeeze at least one more race in before they had to totally stop. Either way, Alfa won both of those races, Farina winning in Libya and again in Geneva. The next win was by Achille Varzi on the 1st of September 1946, when he won on the streets of Turin at Valentino Park. The car would win another 10 races between 1946 and the April of 1950. Because on the 13th of May 1950, a new era in motorsport began. In 1949, Count Antonio Brevio, the head of the Italian sporting authorities, wrote a letter to the Fédération Internationale de Sport Automobile, or FISA as it was known at the time, where he laid down an idea for having a world championship for the drivers with these Formula 1 regulations that had begun in 1947. The FISA president, Hadelin de Liedekerke Beaufort, a Belgian gentleman whose name I've probably just butchered, liked the idea, and it was all put into a calendar for 1950. The drivers wouldn't just be competing on a race-by-race basis, they'd now earn points, and whoever had the most points at the end of the year was the overall winner. The season would be just 6 races long, only a quarter of what we have today, and would be contested at Monaco, Switzerland, Belgium, France and Italy. And I suppose the United States as well, because the Indy 500 was an official round on the calendar. But the first round of the season would be where they raced on Sunday, Silverstone. I've documented the race in its own video. The race fit for a king, I called it, because it's the only time the reigning British monarch has attended the British Grand Prix. And as a fun fact, the national anthem of Britain, called God Save the King, would not be played for a winning driver at Silverstone until 2024, because of the small technicality of it being called God Save the Queen up to September 2022. The first driver to have God Save the King played in any capacity was George Russell. Because of course it was. But Alfa hadn't run this hyper-successful car at all in 1949 because of financial reasons. But with the prestige of a new world championship, there was the opportunity for them to make a comeback, take the title, and reap any rewards that came with it. At this point, the Italians were the dominant force in European motor racing, probably because Mercedes and Audi, as well as the British manufacturers like Jaguar and Bentley, were still recovering from the war. The Jaguar factory at Castle Bromwich in Birmingham had been turned over to producing Spitfires. There was another issue: the drivers. Tragically, in the aftermath of the war, Varzi, Carlo Felice Trossi and Wimille had all died in crashes or other reasons. Alfa still believed that they would still do well though, because Enzo Ferrari's Modena factory had been taken over by the Italian government during the war, and his newer factory at Maranello was only just getting back into the swing of things. But that said, Alfa still needed to take Enzo seriously. They'd still be dominant, but Enzo's cars were circling like vultures. A bit like how Max Verstappen has been picking up the pieces dropped by McLaren over the course of this season. On paper, the pecking order was Alfa, Ferrari, and then a bit of a gap to Maserati and Talbot, or Talbot, or however it's pronounced. But as history would tell us, Ferrari never turned up to that first round at Silverstone. Enzo had been having a bit of a tiz over the starting money that the teams would be getting, which was done based off the popularity, success and some other factors with the teams. Basically, the teams were being paid to race based on, well, their draw, to borrow a term from professional wrestling. I don't know exactly who was getting what, but Enzo had decided that he wasn't getting enough and withdrew his cars. Alfa had made improvements to the car over the years. One of those improvements being to the engine that was at the front, a 1.5 litre straight 8 that was supercharged and chucked out a whopping 350 horsepower, up from the pre-war 225. Now that's nothing today, but when you factor in that this car weighed about the same as a bag of sugar, had super skinny tyres and a driver that had no seatbelts on, this thing was a weapon. It probably had way more power than everybody else on the grid at the same time. But this car had another slight quirk to it which might confuse some people if you're seeing it for the first time. If you learn to drive in a manual car like I did, or many other people have done in Britain and in Europe, you'll have probably been taught your ABCs. Accelerator, brake and clutch. The one on the right is the go pedal, the middle one is the stop pedal, and the one on the far left is the changing gear pedal. Alfa did things slightly differently. The brake was on the right, and the gas was in the middle. How hard can it be? There's actually been a thing done with Martin Brundle and Ollie Bearman driving this car around Silverstone, and Brundle mentions how quirky the setup is. Your whole driving life, the throttle is on the right, but now it's in the middle. So when heel towing, you have to blip your foot to the... Wait, hang on a second, I need to picture this. You brake... No, hang on a second, the brake is now on the right-hand side, so you brake, clutch normally, but then you twist your heel out to the left to blip the throttle, which is now in the middle, instead of going to the right. And I'm doing this at my desk now, and it feels incredibly weird. Why did Alfa do this? No clue. Absolutely no clue. Maybe it was more comfortable that way, maybe it's just an Italian thing. Answers on a postcard. But it must have been alright, because the Alfa was so good that it destroyed the competition at Silverstone. 3 of the 4 Alfas finishing in the top 3. The 4th, driven by Fangio, suffered a problem with the oil pipe and retired on lap 62 of 70, with the winning Alfa of Farina maintaining an average speed of around 90 miles an hour and burning fuel at a rate of 1.5 miles to the UK gallon. Proper stuff. But the thing was, the Alfas were utterly dominant. The Alfas were the only cars on the same lap, and the next competitor was 2 laps down. The final finisher was 6 laps down, and we thought that 2021 Haas was slow. But it wasn't just a power merchant, it won every single one of the 6 races it entered in the 1950 Formula 1 season. The only race it didn't enter was the 1950 Indianapolis 500. Farina had been dominant at Silverstone, but he wouldn't finish the next race at Monaco. The winds at the harbour had been borderline gale force and had blown water onto the track at Tabat Corner. When Fangio got through on the first lap in the lead, it was fine, but Farina aquaplaned and hit the wall on the outside, with about 7 or 8 cars piling in behind him. Fangio came round, saw the mess, tiptoed through, and made it to the finish. But at the same time, Ferrari had found that there was a slight issue with the Alfas, and that was their fuel consumption. Supercars.net said that the 1.5 litre 8-cylinder engine was drinking the petrol and ethanol mix at a rate of 26 gallons per 100 kilometres. Yeah, I mixed metric and imperial there, deal with it, but either way, that's a lot. By this point, Alfa had increased power to 430 horsepower at 9,300 RPM, which was also a lot. They had to refuel twice per race because the 26-gallon tank wasn't enough to get them to the end. So Enzo ordered his boys to try and work out a way of making his engines more powerful, but sip less fuel. And over the course of the season, Ferrari slowly caught up. When they got to the Italian Grand Prix, which was the final race of the season and where the championship would be settled, the Alfas were surprised to see that when they bolted from the line, there was the Ferrari of Ascari right behind them. And they were also surprised to find the Ferrari sitting in between the Alfas on the front row of the grid. Although Ascari's rocker gear failed, and that allowed the Alfas to take the victory, and Farina won the first ever Formula 1 World Championship. But by this point, Alfa had introduced the 159, an evolution of the 158. And one of the key upgrades to the 159 was to that engine. Like just mentioned, it was now producing 450 horsepower, an ungodly amount for the time, which, at Monza, took the Red Alfettas to a mind-numbing 190 miles an hour. Again, easy peasy in a modern car, but at that time, it was warp speed, and it was being done by a 1.5 litre engine as well. And that was part of the reason the fuel economy had become so bad in the latter part of the 1950 season. Apparently, the Talbot Largos could achieve 9 miles to the UK gallon, while the 159 was at 1.5 miles to the UK gallon. It was thirsty, but it was fast. The Alfas could get a massive lead, refuel, and then get back into the lead if they lost it. Much like how Mercedes in their winning years could have absolutely crap strategies, and it wouldn't matter. And that's why the dominance didn't carry over into 1951. The Alfas had become too thirsty to make it count, and Enzo's cars had caught up. At the 1951 British Grand Prix, the cars had to refuel twice, and it was the first time in World Championship history that an Alfa hadn't won a Grand Prix. Okay, yes, the Indy 500, but none of the F1 teams did it. It's also why there's a fair few American drivers listed with one single win in Formula 1, even though the Indy 500 wasn't run to Formula 1 regulations. I think you follow me there. But even with their dominance decreasing, Alfa still won the 1951 Formula 1 World Championship, with Fangio taking the first of what would become a record 5 world titles, a title count that's only been surpassed twice since. At the time of writing, obviously. But the 1951 season would be a turning point because the chassis in use, some of them being in use before the war like the Alfa was, would become obsolete. Due to the provisional calendar having around 20 races, there was a lack of interest because people couldn't justify the costs, with Alfa being one of those teams. And Alfa didn't field any cars in the 1952 season for that reason. As time went on, the organisers of Grand Prix decided to run the races to Formula 2 regulations instead, which had smaller engines and regulations that were cheaper to work with, all in the hope that teams would sign up that way. Remember, at the time, Formula 1 wasn't the name of the championship. It was called the World Championship of Drivers that was run to regulations called Formula 1. The two names weren't synonymous at that time. So because Alfa was out and Mercedes weren't going to come in until 1954 when the regulations changed again, it meant that Ferrari was the only team on the grid building to Formula 1 regulations. The other teams could build to Formula 2 if they wished, but Ferrari was the only one running to Formula 1. So the hope was moving everything to Formula 2 would make Ferrari shrink everything down, and on paper at least, things would become closer together. But it didn't. Ferrari still dominated. They won every single race. Except the Indy 500. Ascari won the title, if you're wondering, but the Alfa 158 and 159 were the 2023 Red Bull, 2004 Ferrari, 2020 Mercedes and Williams FW14B of the time. A winning machine that, aside from a bit of forced sabbatical because of the war, was in service for 9 years, entering a total of 54 races and winning 47 of them. That's an 87% success rate. It's an utterly unbelievable statistic considering you had retirements, fatal crashes and everything else besides. And it's also an historically important car because it was the first winner of the 1950 championship, and therefore the first winner of a World Championship of Drivers race, now Formula 1. And it was a car still dominating despite being a pretty old design by the time the World Championship started. It was a pre-war car, and it had the best drivers in the world behind the wheel. Sure, today it's a relic of days gone by. It doesn't have wings, it doesn't have a halo, there's no side-mounted radiators, there's no seatbelts, it's got skinny tyres that lasted 400 million years, and the steering had about 3 to 5 business days of lag. But it's still an icon. It's just a shame that Alfa Romeo has had such an in-out love affair with Formula 1, much like Renault has. But it's the original. It's the OG, it's the pioneer, and that film with Bearman and Brundle showed just what an amazing car it was when it was moving. I just don't think I'd ever get my head around that pedal layout though. But I'll hand things over to you. What do you think of this car? Is it truly an icon of Formula 1 history, or does it just have the distinction of being the first to set those initial records? Leave any thoughts and opinions down in the conversation zone underneath this video and get a bit of a discussion going. So then, a look at the iconic Alfa 158 and the 159 as well, just to complete things, which were the dominant force in the early part of Formula 1 racing. If this has been interesting for you, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job, and for more tidbits from the motorsport history books or anything else to do around here, you can subscribe and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep the lights on or help with the picture purchasing piggy bank, there will be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and anything else you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for one and done donations and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.